you're concerned about the world, if you're concerned about geopolitics, if you're concerned about a deeper recession, historically, fixed income has done very well in that situation. It had a really bad time, right, in 2022 when interest rates rocketed the way they did, and somewhat in 2023. A lot of that had to do with COVID and that unexpected inflation. And I don't see that happening in 2024.
네, 동아시아 최고의 글로벌 인터뷰 전문 프로그램으로 명실상부하게 자리 잡았다는 이야기를 도대체 언제쯤 들을 수 있을 것인가 고민하면서 꾸준히 인터뷰를 여러분께 전해드리고 있는 글로벌머니토크입니다. 여러분들이 보시기에는 저의 오른쪽, 제가 보기에는 저의 왼쪽에 오늘도 글로벌머니토크의 석가래이자 기둥이자 하여튼 그런 구중한일보 강남규 선임기자 나오셨습니다. 어서 오세요.
안녕하세요.
네.
2% 새해 복 많이 받으십시오.
네, 저희가 엊그저께 사무실 정리를 좀 하면서 글로벌머니토크 채널에 뭐 이런저런 거 쭉 점검도 하고 정리도 하고 했는데 이 채널이 이제 5년째에 접어듭니다.
아니 근데 2% 애초에 3% 내부에서 이게 얼마나 가능하겠어요? 굉장히 냉소적이고 회의적이었다면서요.
그랬죠. 이게 과연 계속 이런 그 걸물과 거물들이 인터뷰가 되겠냐. 그리고 그래도 이건 시도했다는 정도로 추억을 남기자 해서 제가 보기엔 한 서너 번 하고 말겠지라고 생각을 했는데 저도 잘 몰랐고 그리고 사실은 강남규 기자님이 이렇게 열심히 해주실 줄도 몰랐고. 자, 오늘은 누가 또 인터뷰 대상으로 걸려들었습니까?
프랭클린 템플턴 하면은 사실 뭐 굉장히 그 세계적인 자산운용사죠. 자산 규모가 1조 4천억. 우리나라 자산 규모가 1조 4천억 달러. 우리나라 돈으로 한 1,840조 정도 되는 돈을.
그러면 우리나라 국민연금 기금액 그거보다 훨씬 많네요.
그런가요?
거칠게 하면 거의 두 배다라고 해도 그냥
그렇죠.
그쯤 되지 싶은
얘기인데. 그런 물론 이 자산운용사보다 자산 규모가 큰 곳이 많습니다. 블랙록이라든지 스테이트 스트리트라든지.
예, 거기는 뭐 ETF들도 다 자기 자산이라고 하니까.
그렇죠. 근데 이 프랭클린 템플턴의 최고 투자 전략가.
그래요?
네. 그 다음에 재미난 게 이 회사는 요즘은 이제 무슨 금융회사는 약간 좀 이 조직 이름에 인플레이션이 좀 있습니다. 그런데도 인상 깊은 게 프랭클린 템플턴 인스티튜트 무슨 그 연구소 같지 않습니까?
네.
우리 이제 이 투자은행이나 자산운용사의 리서치센터죠. 그 리서치센터장 하고 있으면서 최고 투자 전략가도 하고 있습니다. 그래서 1,400억 달러, 약 1,840조의 돈에 직접적으로 아니요, 그렇지 않고 직접적으로 영향을 미치는 거죠. 전략 수립에 최고 투자 전략가니까. 그래서 그 생각을 엿보기 위해서 그리고 최근에 2024년에 일어날 수 있는 놀라운 5가지 서프라이즈 5 그런 투자 레터를 내서 월가에서 관심이 좀 증폭이 됐었습니다.
그래요?
그래서 오늘 저자직강으로 그 서프라이즈 5가 뭔지 그래서 불렀습니다.
그 레터는 공짜로 뿌리는 레터예요?
그 투자자들에게 보내는 레터죠.
자기 고객한테. 그러니까 이거 그것 좀 보내주세요라고 하면 안 보내주는.
보내주기도 할 겁니다.
그래요?
그냥 저도 하나 받았으니까 사전에.
진짜? 나 그것 좀 나도 좀 주면 안 됩니까?
그럴까요?
우리 시청자들한테도 좀 줄 수 없습니까?
근데 뭐 오늘 저자가 직접 설명을 해주는데.
그런가? 그것도 보고 좀 그 레터
들어보죠 한번.
알겠습니다. 일단 읽어보고 좀 감동스럽다 싶으면 저희가 레터를 한번 구해보겠습니다. 구해지면 저희가 고정 댓글에 올려드릴 거고 댓글에 없으면 그냥 못 구했구나 그렇게 생각하시면 되겠습니다.
제가 갑자기 마음에 부담이 생겨요. 기필코 한 카피 얻어서
사실 카피 얻는 게 문제가 아니라 이 영상 보시는 분들도 참고로 그 레터도 좀 볼 수 있게.
오케이.
그쪽에 아마 폴리시가 있을 거예요.
그죠.
우리나라 말로 번역하면 그 규제 정책 그걸 좀 뚫어주십시오.
오케이, 알겠습니다.
근데 여러분 진짜 운 좋은 줄 아십시오. 정말 2% 만나서 진짜 너무 잘해드린다. 자, 그럼 인터뷰 시작하겠습니다.
미스터 노버 새해 복 많이 받으십시오. 제가 인터뷰 응해 주셔서 감사합니다. 사실 그 최고 투자 전략가라서 그 각종 컨퍼런스, 연초면 컨퍼런스와 인터뷰에 바쁘실 텐데 인터뷰에 응해 주셔서 감사드립니다. 자, 그러면 이제 올해 한 해가 어떻게 될지 예측을 들어보기 전에 2023년이 투자의 역사에서 어떤 한 해였는지를 좀 먼저 돌아볼까 합니다. 이 미스터 도보의 눈에 지난 한 해는 어떤 해였습니까?
I think that a lot of economists and a lot of analysts try to look back in history and they say this is like that period of history or history repeats itself and or something like that. And one of the most famous statements of John Templeton was the most dangerous words in the English language are it's different this time. So it's quite dangerous for me to say that I think what's been different the last 3 years is this incredible COVID crisis and an unusual shock that we've never had before. And so I'm not sure that it's relevant to say that what's happened the last 3 years is similar to the past. It's a different situation. That's why, quite frankly, economists and strategists have just been wrong about their predictions about what's going to happen. So you asked about last year, sitting 1 year from now, when you were talking about predictions, the predictions were very strongly that there was going to be a recession, that US dollar was going to fall a lot, that stock markets were going to fall a lot, and that we'd have more inflation and interest rates might rise. So it's been a crazy year. And all of those things happened at some time. But if you look over the course of the year, most of the strategists, in fact, almost all the strategists were wrong. And so it's been difficult as we try to sort out the remaining impact of COVID and how both the reserve banks responded to that, as well as how the governments responded to that. So as we look into 2024, we're hoping that we're returning to something more normal, if you will. So just to give you an idea, the debate over the last couple of years about inflation was, why do we have inflation? What caused that? Was it because of COVID and being temporary because of the supplies of COVID? Or was it because the government spent so much and caused inflation? And like most things, the answer is probably a little bit of both. But as we're able to recover from COVID and move forward, we think we'll have a more normal economy as we roll into 2024.
네, 미스터 도버. 저도 한 가지 좀 질문을 드리겠습니다. 보통은 투자의 역사를 거슬러 올라가 보면 유동성이 많이 풀린 시즌의 직후에는 그 유동성으로 인한 폭발 내지는 뭐 거품의 붕괴 그런 위기가 있었는데 코로나 시즌에 많이 풀었던 유동성이 그로 인한 뭐 거품 붕괴나 이런 거는 지난해는 없었던 것 같아서 좀 이상하다고 생각되기도 하는데 어떤 차이가 있었다고 생각하십니까?
Yeah, well, we haven't exactly had a bubble burst, but we have had a lot of enthusiasm in different sectors that's unraveled. If you look back prior to COVID, we had a huge movement towards people looking for yield before interest rates were increased, and they put a lot of money into higher risk yield. And that was a bubble, obviously, that burst as interest rates went up. Anybody who was invested in fixed income did terrible, right? And there are some people right now that would argue that the big 7 stocks in the US that have so greatly performed this last year are a potential bubble. I don't think that, but there are some people who argue that. But I think there's always things that are over and underdone. But at least from my current perspective, I don't see us having any big bubbles that are likely to pop and cause great problems in the economy right now, which is hopefully kind of comforting.
미스터 도버, 사실 그 놀랄만한 5가지 투자 레터를 봤을 때 제가 눈에 띄었던 게 secular stagnation, 장기 침체 내지는 추세적 침체라고 하는 말을 썼던데 이게 이제 전 재무장관 미국의 전 재무장관 레리 서머스도 비슷한 예측을 했습니다. 물론 뭐 몇 년 전부터 해온 얘기라서 좀 진부하고 식상한 느낌이 들긴 합니다만은 비슷한 말을 하셨길래 두 분이 짜고 하셨나? 그래서 제가 여쭙니다. 왜 이 장기 침체를 경고하셨는지요?
Yeah, well, that's a very good observation. And Larry Summers is less about secular stagnation, maybe than he was before. So, what do we mean by secular stagnation? That really means that the economy isn't really growing as much. And so, I think that sometimes we get lost in listening to the news or trying to look at what's going to happen in 2024 and forget the real long-term picture of how we actually become more wealthy as an economy. And we do that by increasing the productivity that the people in our countries, in Korea or in the United States, become more productive and can produce more things for less input. That's what makes us wealthy. And I have to say, I've worked with Korea. I think you know I've been to Korea probably 20 or, well, more than 20 times, probably 30 times. I've spent a lot of time in Korea. And when I'm traveling, I always remark that Korea is one of the most remarkable countries in the world for its phenomenal increase in productivity from the 1950s until the present. I think there's, at least historically, there's been no country that has done what Korea's done. So Korea is the best example of amazing increases in productivity. But for the last 20 or 30 years in the US, we haven't had as much of an increase in productivity as we would like to increase our wealth. A lot of our wealth has become because we've increased leverage. If you look at a lot of the financial vehicles or companies, they've increased their debt, they've reduced the amount of equity that they have, and that's how they have become more profitable. So what is going to make us, the world, more productive in the next 10 or 20 years? Clearly, another thing that made us very productive in the last 20 years or so is the massive expansion of the emerging markets, particularly China. But it's unlikely, well, it just won't happen that China will grow in the next 10 or 20 years like it has in the past. So that's why, remember, these surprises are hopefully surprises. So hopefully this is something that might happen, but won't necessarily happen. But how are we going to have growth? And that is actually one way that could happen is if something like artificial intelligence or really some of the changes that we're making in biotechnology can increase productivity. I'm skeptical about that, but that is one way we could get out of growth. So right now we have too much savings and not enough things to invest in, and that's why we might have secular stagnation.
네, 그리고 한 가지 그 투자 레터에 정치 리스크를 경고하셨던데요. 거기에 대해서도 좀 설명을 해주시죠.
First of all, 2024 is an unusual year because there are about 40 countries, or half the world is going to have elections. And so it's not just the United States, it's many countries. And I think that there is definitely a populist movement that's global, a lack of trust in institutions that's global, and some real frustration with incumbent politicians. So voters, or if they're in countries that are even more authoritarian, the populists are not very happy. The strange thing is that for most people, 2023 was actually a pretty good year in terms of the economy was much stronger, certainly in the United States, but in other countries as well. The markets were good. So there's a mismatch between how someone like myself would say, hey, things look pretty good. And someone says on the street, well, that's easy for you to say. But for me, I'm upset about, I don't know, social issues or inflation's too high or I'm not having the life that I want. So I think that there's a lot of risk of some pretty dramatic changes in politics around the world. And that will impact the investment outlook as different politicians will change will change what happens in countries and what investments make sense and what don't.
미스터 도버, 사실 그 아직은 섣부른 말일 수 있는데 올해 11월 대선에서 도널드 트럼프 전 대통령이 승자가 될 수 있을 것 같은 여론조사들이 많이 나오고 있습니다. 만약에 트럼프가 차기 대통령이 된다라면은 어떤 기업이 득을 볼까요?
I think that it's very hard to predict the connection between a political administration and stocks. And so certainly former President Trump has stated pretty strongly that he doesn't like the social media companies, or at least many of them, and some of the technology companies. But those companies have been the backbone of growth for the economy in the U.S. And so I think he's unlikely to actually hurt the companies, but I think there could definitely be a lot of noise. And remember, when we're talking about the really big companies, they are much broader than being social media. So maybe what I would say is probably social media companies might have some concerns if he was president, but I think that probably technology, innovation, artificial intelligence, that type of thing in general would probably do fairly well under him, or not so much different under him than they would under a Biden administration. And I can't keep on top of US politics. So how Koreans keep on top, I don't know. We do have the different houses and the courts and everything else. So it isn't as simple as what the president wants to do. In order for either, presuming that Biden and Trump are the candidates, in order for any of them to do a whole lot, they would have to have control of everything. And I think the most likely thing is whoever wins president probably will not have control of both houses.
네, 미스터 도버 또 하나의 질문을 좀 드려보겠습니다. 지난해까지 재작년, 작년 등에 걸쳐서 미국 중앙은행의 금리를 유례 없이 가파른 폭으로 올렸고 그 출발했던 제로금리 수준에서 보면 굉장히 많이 올린 금리인데 그럼에도 불구하고 미국 기업들이 뭐 줄줄이 부도가 나거나 하는 그 우려했던 측면, 예상했던 사건들은 잘 일어나지 않았습니다. 올해는 어떨 걸로 예상하십니까?
So Warren Buffett had a famous kind of joke that I always liked, and that was that you don't know who's not wearing a swimming suit at the beach until the tide goes out. And I think it's true with credit that we don't really know what is out there. And we've gone through some really complicated times. So if we think about it, when interest rates were really low, almost anybody could get credit. And investors were looking for high interest rates. And I have to say, that's true of a lot of Korean and Japanese and Asian investors. You were searching for yield, right? And so you bought some things that at higher interest rates wouldn't do very well. And so that's one issue. The second issue is that there's a tremendous amount of private debt, and that private debt is not regulated, and we don't know really what's there. So some of that is probably going to companies or investments that maybe aren't very good. So I might have, or you might have thought, I might have thought, why haven't we had a problem so far? And I would say that that is because the rise in interest rates hasn't been happening for that long. So most companies are not impacted. Most companies and even consumers are not impacted by the rise in interest rates. So the Fed has had a rapid increase in rates, but not the impact that it had in the past, because people, when rates were low, financed for a very long time. To give you an example, in the United States, we talk a lot about mortgage rates. Mortgage rates have gone from 3% to over 7%. That's terrible. However, the average mortgage rate that people have has gone from something like 3% to 3.3%, almost no change, because people just stopped borrowing money. And that's true with companies. So we're playing a little chicken and egg, and that is these bad companies might survive for another 6 months or a year if they don't have to refinance. But if they do have to refinance at the higher rates, they could be in trouble. So I'm not predicting some big problem. I'm almost doing a funny thing here. I'm almost saying something's going to happen, but I don't know what it is, which is a kind of odd prediction, right? But that's how these things often crack. Nobody predicted the fall of Silicon Valley Bank. But what was Silicon Valley Bank doing? Well, it was a mismatch between short-term and long-term interest rates. And there's other companies or somebody out there. And so if what most people are predicting, that we are going to have a soft landing and interest rates are going to drop, hey, that's Goldilocks. Those companies might escape. But if we have a shock and interest rates don't drop, inflation stays higher for longer, the Fed is right more than the market. The market thinks rates are going to drop a lot sooner than the Fed. Well, some of these companies could get in trouble. And that's why I say really low quality credit could crack. So I would caution your listeners to do some really good due diligence before they make their investments.
아까 그 증시에 거품일지도 모른다는 이야기가 있다는 정도로 정리해 주셨던 그 빅7 종목 요즘 많이 오르고 있는데 그 종목들을 중심으로만 오르는 미국 증시를 보면 역시 양극화라는 단어가 떠오르지 않을 수 없습니다. 올해 2024년에는 이 양극화가 좀 완화될 걸로 보십니까? 아니면 여전할 걸로 보십니까?
So let's look at that. Interesting year, 2023. 7 stocks accounted for 2/3 of the return. Unbelievable. That's why they sometimes call them the Magnificent Seven. Why did they do that? Well, I think it's a couple good reasons and maybe a couple not so good reasons. A good reason is they had massive increases in earnings. So most of the earnings increase of the S&P 500 this last year came from those 7 stocks. And so that's a good reason, right? They had earnings that were higher than was expected. They don't seem overly expensive compared to the history. So I don't think we're in a bubble in the same way we were in 1999. But all the other stocks lagged behind this year until about October. And then in October, so if you look at the year as a whole, it looks like it's Magnificent Seven, 2/3 of the total return, everything's the story of them. But if you look at the year and break it up, the Magnificent Seven did phenomenally until October. And then since October, they've done well, but other stocks have done even better. So smaller cap stocks have done better. The general market has done better. So it's a story of 2 tales within the year. So you're right. A market where only 7 stocks are accounting for all the growth is an unhealthy market. And what I predicted and what I wrote last year and what I predict for the year ahead is hopefully the market will broaden out. So I think those 7 stocks are great stocks. They're great companies. but they're not likely to have the great appreciation they had this last year. And other stocks that are cheaper are likely to catch up to them. That's the story of a healthy market, and that's been very true the last couple months. So that's kind of how I look at those. If I may say, the other thing is that if we're right, and inflation's peaked, and interest rates are going to drop, and we either have a soft landing or even if we have a hard landing, the U.S. is likely to be a leader in dropping rates. And if that happens, the dollar is likely to drop too. So what that means is that there's likely to be some more opportunity in stocks outside of the United States as well.
경력 가운데 상당 기간을 해외 시장 분석과 전망에 전망하시는 데 보내셨는데 2023년 사실 그 연초의 인터뷰, 지난해 연초의 인터뷰에서 올해 일본 증시가 좋을 것 같다라고 말씀하셨는데 그 말씀이 적중했습니다. 그렇다면은 2024년 일본 증시 어떻게 계속 잘 될까요?
Yeah, so last year when I did the interview, I was positive about Japan. And fortunately, Japan has done very well. So that turned out to be a good prediction. So I do think that I tell you kind of a bad joke, but my entire career has been a global investor. But for the last 5 or 7 years, everybody only wants to talk to me about America because America's stocks have done so well. So I'm happy that markets outside of the United States are doing well, and I think will do well. So a few things about Japan. The return in Japan was pretty good this last year, right? So the dollar return was about 18%. The local return was about 21%. Given that, how do we look at Japan going into 2024? And I think valuations are still not very high. And so I think that's a positive for Japan. Why has Japan done so terribly for the last 32 years since its peak in around 1992? Well, my view is that Japan never really became shareholder friendly, and it never really dealt with the crisis of the great overvaluation of real estate. It didn't let its companies go bankrupt. It didn't purge because that's very painful. That's what happened. That's why, in my opinion, America did so much better after 2008 than Europe did or other countries did. So a nice change in Japan is that it's becoming much more shareholder friendly, and it's more thinking about the shareholder. If I may distract for a moment, one of my long-term opinions on China was being very positive on Chinese growth, but not being very positive on Chinese stock market, because China was never very shareholder friendly. It never gave the returns to the shareholder. The third thing is that the structure of the Bank of Japan over the last 30 years and keeping interest rates so low has encouraged Japanese people to invest outside of Japan. And as we have a new head of the Bank of Japan, and as they end yield curve control, I think that probably Japanese money will come back to invest in Japan. And that's very positive also for foreign investors. It means that the yen, perhaps, and I was wrong about this last year, but I think the yen could actually appreciate. And there's just a lot of good, solid companies in Japan. So that's the reason why we continue to be positive on Japan as we look into this next year.
저는 또 하나 궁금한 시장이 있는데 인도입니다. 인도 증시도 꽤 많이 잘 올랐고요. 그리고 시장에서는 중국을 대체할 수 있는 시장이라는 이야기도 하고 있고 또 신흥시장 전문가이시기도 하니까 인도에 대한 생각을 어떻게 갖고 계시는지 매우 궁금한데 어떻게 생각하십니까?
I have spent a lot of time in India. I've also been to India 20 or 30 times, and I started Well, I started our local offices in both China and India. And I think you know I've also managed the Korean office, so I have some history there. And I've always been very positive about India. But I think India is very different in terms of its structure. I don't think it's likely that India will ever become the manufacturing hub that China has become. I think that the way the Chinese government is structured and its ability to marshal people and manufacturing, India hasn't shown the ability to do that in the same way. I think that the growth of India is probably going to become more from technology, and to use the term we've now used a lot, innovation. And so I'm very positive on the growth of India, but I don't think it'll have the same impact on global productivity and global prices. So if you think about what's happened over the last 30, 40 years with China, basically the low end, well, even more than the low end manufacturing for the entire world moved from the developed world to China. I mean, it's an unbelievable change. And China was able to provide very low cost labor. And so that's where the productivity increased, at least globally. I think as we look forward for the next 30 years, we've seen a lot of manufacturing go back to the developed world. You've seen a country like Korea that doesn't have the low-cost labor that China does, but is much more efficient and can get productivity out of a higher educated and more efficient workforce. So no, I don't see India kind of having, I'm positive on India, but I don't see India having the same impact on costs and on productivity that China did over the last 30 or 40 years.
미스터 도버, 지난해는 사실 AI가 그 테마였습니다. 그렇다면 2024년 올해 기술 혁신 측면에서 어떤 게 테마가 될 것 같습니까?
So when I was trying to remember, when I'm trying to pick surprises, remember they need to be surprises. So I'm trying to say things that not everybody else says. And I do think I'm very excited about artificial intelligence going forward. And I'm very excited about biomedical bioscience. And those two things are related to each other. But the exploration of space and the zero gravity environment is another thing that we haven't heard so much about. I don't know that people are aware, but I'm not a scientist, so I'm not an expert in this, but I was not aware that if you go into space, it's actually fantastic for doing a lot of chemical engineering and manufacturing, and there's all types of putting together of chemical compounds and new drugs that can be done when you get into a no-gravity environment. And also, as you can tell, there's a bit of a space race to get to the moon. Apparently, all of the recent rockets, whether it's Russian, Chinese, or US, aren't doing very well, but that is that race and innovation. So you were talking about bubbles and fads. So certainly 2023 was the year of everybody getting excited about artificial intelligence. And all I'm saying is maybe people wake up a little bit and get a little bit excited about some of the innovation and opportunities that are going to happen around exploring space.
네, 그 채권 얘기를 좀 해보겠습니다. 뭐 아시겠지만 지난해에는 금리가 계속 들썩들썩 올라가고 그러는 바람에 채권 투자자들에게는 암흑기였었는데요. 채권에 대해서 어떻게 보십니까? 앞으로 뭐 안정적으로 금리가 쭉 내려가는 쪽이라면 이제 채권 투자자들에게는 즐거운 시즌이 될 텐데 2024년이 그동안 고생했던 채권 투자자들에게 이제 고생 끝났다고 이야기해 줄 만한 전환점이 될 수 있을까요?
The short answer is yes. And I think the long answer for 2023 is it was even mixed, right? So for people who thought, myself included, that 2023 would be a decent year for fixed income, oh my goodness, I had to hide under a rock in March. And in the middle of the year, when interest rates actually went way up above 5%, it looked terrible, right? But if you look at the end of the year and you look at what happened in the last couple of months, interest rates did drop quite a bit and fixed income did very, very well. So this is the simple calculation that I make and that I would say is a pretty strong conviction I have for the investors listening. And that is the likely scenario is that the economy will slow and we won't fall into a recession. That's consensus. There is some probability that one of those things that I said could happen, the surprises of something blowing up, happens and we go into a deep recession. If either of those things happen, it's going to be a great year for fixed income. The scenario where it's not going to be a good year for fixed income is if inflation surprises on the upside and the economy is just so strong that interest rates aren't cut. That could happen. And frankly, let's hope that's true because that's best for all of us, but it's much less likely. So I think that the first issue that investors have, including your Korean audience, is that they have a lot of money in cash. And if interest rates are, and that's been great, and they've had a good yield on that cash. But if interest rates drop, that cash yield drops quickly. And the way to lock in that yield is to invest in fixed income. So that's the first reason to invest in fixed income. Also, if you're concerned about the world, if you're concerned about geopolitics, if you're concerned about a deeper recession, historically, fixed income has done very well in that situation. Fixed income has done pretty well for the last 35 years, actually since 1982, since September of 1982 to be specific. But it had a really bad time, right, in 2022 when interest rates rocketed the way they did, and somewhat in 2023. But again, to start or go back to where we started our conversation, a lot of that had to do with COVID and that unexpected inflation. And I don't see that happening in 2024.
사실 지난해 외국인 투자자들이 한국 증시에서 상당히 돈을 빼내갔습니다. 그 바람에 코스피 지수가 뭐 좀 시원찮았습니다. 어때 2024년에는 어떨 것 같습니까? 외국인들이 좀 한국에 대해서 관심을 갖고 돌아올까요?
I think foreign investors pulled money out of many markets outside the United States, and net they pulled market out of the United States too. It's why there's been such a rush to catch up with the market recently, because remember, virtually everybody said 2023 was going to be a terrible year for stocks. And so there was a lot of money that came out of the market. So money coming out of Korea isn't unique. Secondly, money that went into the market, not unlike Korean investors, went into 7 stocks, right? So there was this high concentration. And even Korean investors did that. They didn't invest back in Korea. They invested in the 7 stocks, right? I think that I'm not an expert on the won and where it will go, but I suspect that if the U.S. Interest rates drop, that'll be good for the won. So all that said, Korea still performed pretty well last year. It was up in dollar terms about 22%. It was up about 24%. The Kospi was up a lot more, right? So if somebody invested in that was a lot better. We think that probably earnings growth over the next 12 months in Korea is going to be a little bit better than the rest of Asia, and it's actually been improving. So I think that's positive for the Korean market. Korea is not expensive relative to other countries, so valuations look good. Exports are starting to improve within Korea, so that's a positive. And consumption, which is pretty big in Korea compared to a lot of other countries, continues to be at least subdued, but I don't see that there's a problem in consumption. So all of those issues make us relatively positive on Korea. I'm not as, I think I'm known for being positive on Japan and India. So I haven't said such positive things about the outperformance of the Korean market, but it follows that I'm relatively positive on Asia ex-Japan, ex-China, and that Korea falls into that. I've been working in Korea for a long time, and I've been to Korea. I was in Korea at least a couple times a year, all the time, except for COVID. Like I said, the great exception. So I have a very kind of positive view of Korea. We talked about productivity, governance, that type of thing. I mean, Korea is just very, very strong. And so it's hard for me to predict the next 12 months. I told you my kind of thought on that, but long term, I'm quite positive on Korea.
미스터 도버 인터뷰 응해 주셔서 감사합니다. 올해 연말에 다시 한번 우리 글로벌머니토크에 출연하셔서 본인의 예측이 얼마나 적중했는지를 재점검하시길 바랍니다.
다음에 인터뷰 좀 한 번 더 하자는 뜻이었어요.
예.
네, 고맙습니다.
감사합니다.
I am more than happy to talk to you as often as you'd like to. And we can talk about this type of thing, or we can talk about longer term philosophy, whatever you prefer.
재미있게 들으셨습니까? 새로운 이야기가 얼마나 있었는지 모르겠습니다만 저는 개인적으로는 세계에서 가장 큰 돈덩어리, 돈 주머니를 움직이는
그죠.
실무자 중에 가장 탑이 어떻게 보고 있느냐는 그게 평범한 결론이든 새로운 이야기든 그 자체가 매우 중요했다라는 생각이 드는데
그렇죠.
보통 문제 이런 인터뷰 하나 하면 그냥 요란하게 또 알려드리고 해야 되는데 저희는 그냥 조용히 보시면 보시고 마시면 마시고
우리는 일상이기 때문에.
네, 그럼 다음 시간에는 또 어떤 분하고 인터뷰를?
사실 좀 핫한 인물이죠. 최근에 삼성물산의 지배 구조를 개선을 하면은 시장에서 내재 가치에 비해 저평가받고 받아서 주주들이 손해를 보고 있는 삼성물산의 어떤 가치가 급등할 것이다 라는 보고서를 냈습니다. 그리고 삼성물산을 지주회사로 전환을 해라라는 레코멘데이션을 제시했던 영국의 행동주의 펀드 펠리서의 최고 자산운용 책임자 CIO 제임스 스미스를 인터뷰를 했을 예정입니다.
삼성물산을 공격하고 있는 겁니까?
그렇죠.
그렇군요. 어떤 의견을 갖고 있는지
한번 직접 들어보죠.
네, 그럼 다음 시간에 저희가 준비해 보겠습니다.
예.